Today we are going to be talking about my 6 tips for great scenario design.
So, the big question is this. How are instructional designers like us, who can't sit back and accept the status quo, who are striving to realize our own creative potential, how do we work in a way that lets us truly create and contribute and make an impact that we can be proud of, while at the same time fall in love with the process? That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Anna Abramowitz, and I want to welcome you to the Scenario Secrets podcast.
Hey everybody, Anna Abramowitz here. Thank you so much for joining me. Yes, it's been quiet for a little while. I was running the Learner Engagement Summit, and it was a lot. But I'm back, and I got some new lessons. I got some fresh new insights. I'm going to noodle on them with you. Yes, I said noodle. I know it's weird. Okay. So this morning I put together a post, and I thought I'd kind of talk through it here as well, because then I could add a little bit more context to some of my scenario tips for you. And one of the things I just want to make a differentiation is that, one, these tips are, things that I've noticed, so there might not all be applicable to you or work in your context, but I think they are, like, over time, I've seen these kind of work. And you might disagree with me, but I ask you to have an open mind to see if this is something that you might be able to implement. Now, one of the things I find is, one, a lot of things come from when people craft scenarios, and I see instructional designers do this. When they craft scenarios, they craft them in the way that they craft multiple choice questions. And while there is definitely some overlay with that, a scenario is different. A scenario is like a conversation somebody would have in their head, and then we're faced at a choice moment. So it's not a quiz check. It's not a what's the best what's the best way to I'm kind of getting into scenarios already. What is the temperature for this cake? What did they say? It's more of a, here's a situation, what do you do next? So it's the choices are very much decisions, and the decisions are meant to help you decide how to move forward, or they're meant to show you what happens as a result of this decision that you're making. So one of the things you want to do is make it super contextual and all those other things. Like, it is a situation that somebody who is your end user, who you're designing this for, would find themselves in the real world. It's nothing made up. And so you get that by talking to practitioners, obviously, and talking to people who actually live in that context. So there are some tips that I'm going to be giving to you that are going to be very much focused on making sure that that conversation flows. And when somebody gets to a decision point, it feels very natural, but it also feels very compelling and difficult, because you've crafted it in a way that makes that choice difficult to make. You've stacked the odds that people are going to make the wrong decision because they have certain things that are holding them back or that influence them in making this decision. And that's kind of, for me, is kind of like the sexiest, nerdiest, awesomest thing about scenarios, is discovering how can I massage this so that it actually turns into something that's like a really compelling problem for my end user. Like, imagine if somebody walks away from a 15-minute experience and all they've had to do is just, like, really deeply think about what they're going to do and then see what happens. And that just, like, that's the most powerful experience they had all day, because they got to see how the world, turns out as a result of the things that they were making, and those decisions actually challenge them. So that's pretty cool. And before I get into my tips, recently one of our students, Teresa, posted her. She launched her interactive story, Sink or Speak. It's about a young woman who is faced with being just Maybe she was raised a certain way to be polite and accommodating and people pleaser. Some of us are just, that way. We just have these personalities. But then it's difficult to then speak up for yourself in a place where you've always been told, or maybe in a household or something you've always been told. Like when I was raised, the culture that I was raised in is that children don't speak at the table. Children are like fish; they don't speak. That was a saying, and that was hard for me because I got in trouble a lot because I couldn't follow those rules. But that's not everybody, right? So, anyways, but one of the things that she was really worried about, and I get this, is that when you come really close to your story and your subject matter, the right choices are very obvious to you because you just know it, right? And so one of the things that we struggle with, and that's why we always have to keep on testing with other people and end users, is do each of our options actually look like super compelling? And she got a note, she posted in our community. She got a note from somebody who said, I loved it. It was great. And I really had to stop and think about the choices. And she said that for her was like, yeah, that was the win, because you really want to put people in dilemmas, because that means you're actually challenging them, challenging their, perceptions and what to do next. So that was like a super win. Anyways, but that's one of the tips we're going to get into. All right. So without further ado, okay. So, and this kind of, you put tip number 1, you would have probably already drawn this conclusion, is that all options are lessons. You can't think you can't think of any of your options as throwaways. In fact, when you're designing great scenarios, and that's kind of maybe the difference between, writing just a regular exam multiple choice question to actually crafting a meaningful scenario, is that in a scenario, each one of those options is a reflection of the bias or the assumptions or the misconceptions that somebody has about making that decision. So there's not going to be any options where it's like, what's the best thing to do here? And it's like, buy a beer. You're never going to have these goofy answers, because in a well-crafted scenario, every single one of your decisions leads to something. It leads to a consequence. And so that consequence is a lesson. And so if you have a scenario where one of your choices is clearly bogus, you've wasted an opportunity to teach somebody a lesson. Because each of those, if one of the things that, people always say, oh, well, what if my end user chooses all the wrong options? Won't they be taught all the wrong things? And it's like, no, actually what will happen is, even if they choose all the wrong options, which sometimes, this is a different consideration because there's mechanics underneath these things and intent. But each one of those options ends up teaching them a lesson through that consequence, and maybe the reflection that the character makes about the decision that they made. And so even if they choose all the wrong options throughout, guess what? If you have 6 wrong answers, you got 6 consequences, and you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of lessons I got packed into a small session, because I saw what happened and I can go back and try again, or other things. And there's ways to think about this, like, well, if somebody continues picking the wrong choice, maybe they're not actually getting the lesson. And that's true. And depending on your interactive story, you might want to have people not continue if they're continuously making the same mistake, kind of like Broken Coworker. Check that out if you haven't yet. BrokenCoworker.com, we have this kind of like a mechanic underneath that says, if you continue choosing the wrong options, we're not going to let you continue because you're obviously not getting the lesson. But every single time you make a wrong decision, you are given a lesson. And so hopefully by like the 3rd time, you're like, this isn't working for me. I should figure this out. Maybe my approach is not helpful. So, like I said, all options are lessons. Do not have any options that are not legit. And if you have a difficulty finding options that are legit, that means you are not, if you're not the subject matter expert, then you should be talking to people who are practitioners so they can help you come up with legit options that they would find compelling. Okay, number 2, keep options to 3. 3 options. Anything more can be overwhelming. And people will fight me on this because nobody likes hardcore numbers, but you know what? 3 works. 3 options work. If you have like 5 or 6, I find that overwhelming. I find it you quickly lose, by the time you get to the 5th one, you're like, what was the first one again? I just find, like, especially in a place where you're really focused on people making decisions and choices, and there's a certain kind of momentum you want them to keep, I'd say stick to 3. And if you have 5 or 6 options, use that sparingly. If you want to, like, let's say I've seen scenarios where you have like 2 or 3 options consistently, and then all of a sudden one is like 6 options, because they wanted to show in that instance that this would be a very difficult and overwhelming decision because all of the options available to you. And that was once that I saw that actually used, because it was contextual for that specific situation. They were trying to put this pressure on you during that situation. So that was when it worked. But otherwise, when you see those multiple choice questions on exams, which are like A or B or C or C and A, don't go there. That is just meant for, like, those are stupid questions, and they are meant to confuse you instead of help you think. So the most important thing here is that your 3 options are all super credible, and they all tackle those, like I said before, each one of them is a lesson. Each one of them is a bias or an assumption or a misconception or whatever that the learner holds, and this is how they are verbalizing it, and that's why they would choose that option. Number 3, not all options need to be good, bad, or worse. Good, better, best, all kinds of stuff. And I think we're also taught that classical questioning. You don't have to have green, yellow, or red. It's not like stoplights. It doesn't have to be like stoplights. It can be, and I got this from talking with Mo Ash, who really, on my request, really dug into options with scenarios, is that you can have, and this happens in real life, not always. Sometimes there is a best option, but sometimes you have 3 options and they're all bad, except they have levels of sacrifice. If I choose this, it'll be the least impactful here. And so, we're talking about real life decisions. And so if you want to, if there are decisions where it's simply, there isn't a best option, there's just the calculated, the end user has to decide which of these would be most advantageous, even if all of them are going to cause some sort of a negative effect. That is still cool. And there might be 2. And it depends on, what's the lesson you want people to get out of this specific scenario? What are the factors you want them to consider? Because you could even say, okay, if they choose A, which makes you, be a better leader, but you lose morale, then maybe later on the decisions that you get faced with are different or scored differently in your scenario because you made this decision, or because if you consistently default to making leadership decisions while sacrificing morale, you will actually lose more people in the context. So you can get very nuanced. And so I'm saying that it's not like every single decision is going to be like this, but you can use this with even a mechanic underneath, or a scoring mechanism underneath, to make sure that your scenarios are reflective of what happens in the real world, which is sometimes that you don't have a best option. It's just choosing the one of the lesser evils, right? I hope that's clear. All right, test your options with end users. This is so cool. I have a story around this one. It's pretty awesome. So one of my students, Talvi, she designed an interactive story. First, it was her outline. She put together all these questions that somebody would have in a scenario, and she wanted to validate them because it was very cool. She was going off of like data from the call center about things that were not working properly, where people were making common mistakes. She talked to the Q&A team who listened to the calls for the call center reps, and she put together this really cool sequence of decisions they'd have to make. And then what she did is she printed out the questions, and she had a couple of people sitting in a room. So what she'd do is she'd be like, okay, here's the scenario, here's what's going to happen, here's what the customer says. Now go to question 1 and choose which option you'd choose based on what I just told you. And so they kind of did the exercise individually, right? And then they handed back the pieces of paper with all her ABCD question or ABC options marked, which one they would go for. And she's like, so how did it go? How did you find it? And they were like, it was super easy. Yeah, that was easy. Yeah, those weren't really challenging. And she was like super nervous. She's like, oh no, I wrote these scenarios with these options and they were like, this is too easy, right? I didn't do it right. Then she looked at the answers. And guess what? They messed up on a lot of them. And that to her indicated that she was on the right track because they assumed like their assumptions were coming through. They were making judgments about how they should solve the situations. And then they would just pick those, and to them, they were super confident in the choices that they made. To them, it was easy, but those were not the right ways to handle the situation. And therefore, in the actual, then worked out e-learning interactive story, they would actually see the consequences of those actions and actually get the benefit of that, which is so cool and so absolutely useful. So for her, it was like she had this moment of panic, and then she had this kind of like this cool kind of revelation of like, yeah, I'm on the right track, and this is really, really necessary because people are making these mistakes and they really are making them very unconsciously. So that was pretty cool. So always test with your end users if you can. You can just send random, well-selected people who are going to be your end user, send them an email. Say, here's what's going to happen. What would be your option, or what would you choose? And see what they choose. And if everybody, you send it to 5 people and everybody chooses A and A is the right answer, you're not making those others really compelling. You're not picking up, if you know that people are making mistakes in this area, then that means you're not capturing that mistake in the right way. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Another one, and I think I'm going to end on this one because, I could go on and I don't want to make this too long for you, but it's really about language. And this is number 5. Language is so important. The way that you phrase those options, it really has to be like the kind of almost language somebody would say in their head. It can't be too formal because it will jar them out of that decision if they don't understand it, if it doesn't sound natural. So your scenario, all you're constantly doing is kind of simplifying it and making it native to that person, capturing the language from that person. That's why I think talking to practitioners and interviewing them, but also recording those conversations so you can go back to and find the way they say the things and then putting those exact words into your scenarios, into your situations. It creates something that doesn't feel like was created by a stranger who doesn't live in that workflow. It's something that they'd use. And so because it sounds like very much like something they'd say, it makes it more compelling for them to choose because it's the language that came out of somebody's head who actually lives in that context. So language is so important. And also, and I got this from Mike Taylor, and I agree with him wholeheartedly, is that he said, writing is such an important skill to hone, and he's constantly honing it. I'm constantly honing it, and I know like my partner Ryan Martin, he's that's one of the things he said is like, it's if we as all professionals, but especially with writing, because we are creating so many things that, like, with different contexts, right? Like job aids, like we basically are building apps, but these are becoming more and more, the more usable they become, the more that language, that's really, it's about the language that they use. So great apps use really simple, beautiful language that's clear and focused. And so that's really what we're doing with these scenarios as well. We're trying to make them as clear, as concise, and as actionable as possible, but also as natural for that end user to be like, yeah, this is what I would say, this is what I would think, therefore this is what I will choose. And so I hope that makes sense. Now, I'll have obviously more, because I also posted this in a couple of groups to see what people think, and I know I'm going to get a whole bunch of feedback and ideas, and I'll share those with you in an upcoming episode. But in the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Now, if you want to learn more about what I do, or interactive storytelling, or scenarios, anything like that, go to scenariosecrets.com and check out the free training there. You're going to love it. Also, if you haven't already, make sure you leave a review. And if you really enjoyed this particular episode, I'd love to know that. The way for you to show me that would be if you took a screenshot of your phone and just shared it on social media and made sure you tag me. All right? Hope you have a fabulous day, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.